Welcome everyone to the webinar Amphibian ID this afternoon. My name is Ashley Smithers and I am joined by our presenter, Char Corkran. Clark's Conservation District is a non-regulatory agency that works with residents of Clark County, providing technical assistance to encourage good stewardships of our environment. We put on a number of workshops like the one you guys are all attending today. Please check out our past webinars on our website, clarkcd.org. There you can also sign up for newsletters to hear about any of our future webinars. We do have two upcoming webinars. One is going to be a tour of Clark County amphibians, focusing on kind of the different sites and areas that we are finding amphibians in Clark County. And then the other one is going to be specifically about stormwater and amphibians, and that one's scheduled for the 26th of April. So to find out all that great information, you can again sign up to receive our newsletters or check back on our website. So with that, I want to get to the good part of the presentation, Char. Char is a Portland area naturalist and wildlife consultant who helped founded the Northwest Ecological Research Institute, also known as NERI, in 1985. She still serves on the board, and she also co-authored the book Amphibians of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia with Chris Toms in 1996. The latest edition came out this last year. Char is an avid amphibian surveyor, birder, and hiker, as well as a writer and photographer. You will see some of her amazing photography work during this presentation. So with that, I'm going to change it over to Char.
Thank you, Ashley. Some of my amazing photography is ancient slides that I had to scan. So anything that's not perfect is probably old. Before I get started, I want to just show you a couple of things that will show up in a lot of the slides. They are basically viewing boxes that hold water and hold an amphibian. And so big critters are going to be in that box. That gives you an idea of the size. Tiny critters might be in a little box like that. And sometimes things are in a little blue cup like that, and you'll see a curved edge. I've lost the quarter cup measure. I've lost the third cup measure. I'm up to the half cup measure. And frequently there'll be a ruler. It'll be a 6-inch, 15-centimeter ruler. Okay, with that, let's see if I can. All right, Ashley, can we get the poll off of there? Do I have to see that? I don't know why I'm. Okay.
You got it, Char?
Welcome to the amphibian training session. That's what Chris and I always used to call them. We can help teach you how to train your pet tadpole to dance to music, or sometimes you can train a giant salamander to sing opera. Or you might be able to get a salamander to count. Many of them can. Okay, we'll get serious now. Ashley, I'm still seeing this poll. Is that okay? Because I can't. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so we've got two basic types of amphibians. Those are salamanders and frogs. I'm sure most of you know that. In the tropics, there's another type called a Sicilian. I've never met one, so I'm not going to say a word about them. Our ambassador for salamanders is, of course, the rough-skinned newt. If you haven't met one, I don't know where you've been in the Pacific Northwest. They are pretty common, not when it's really hot and dry. They are by far the most commonly seen type of salamander. And the Pacific tree frog, also known as Pacific chorus frog, is probably our best known frog. Well, certainly our best known frog. It's the only one you're really likely to hear Some people get upset when there are too many of them singing right outside their window, but in the springtime, that to me, the sound of chorus frogs is the sound of spring in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm going to, instead of talking about all the salamanders and then all the frogs, I'm going to go kind of by the habitats where you might find these things. I seem to have lost my pointer again, but anyway, maybe I can find it. Nope. Okay, so we'll start with amphibians that breed in ponds. Now, a beaver pond is just perfect habitat, partly because it's got, usually has trees around it, it's got water that's slow, and then it's got water that's moving through. And that's, those are all really wonderful. But most of us don't have a beaver pond in our backyard. Although you might have one in a nearby park or forested area. But even a small backyard can provide actually quite a bit of habitat, especially if you're relatively close to bigger ponds and forests and whatever. So just in my backyard, I've got a little pond that you can see on the left. It was originally a spa bathtub sunk in the ground. And my little patch of woods has nice, messy down logs, rotting logs, leaves, branches, scraggly ferns, moss, and everything else. So that's that. We can all do a little bit for habitat for amphibians in our own backyards. Okay, so let's get to the species. Here's our Pacific tree frog. I'm just going to call them tree frogs. You can call them chorus frogs. That's perfectly correct also. Don't expect them all to be bright green because they come in every color imaginable. Actually, I've never seen a purple one, but I wish I could point. Anyway, up middle of the top is a turquoise blue one that was amazing. They all have a little bit bumpy skin, but the back is rather smooth and does not have any ridges along it. And they all do have that black line through the eye. It kind of camouflages the eye from a predator. And that sharp black line, or it might be just dark brown, it really shows up well. So you can frequently see that from a distance. Our other quite common frog in the Pacific Northwest, including Clark County, is the northern red-legged frog. And I'm just going to call it red-legged frogs. They are bigger than tree frogs, not as brightly colored, except for the underside of the back legs. They are really red, but they often hide that color. You'll notice on all of these photos that the frogs have a ridge along the side of the back, kind of from the eye. I wish I had my pointer. I don't know why it doesn't work, but anyway, it goes from the back of the eye along the side of the back, almost to the end of its body. And that's really distinctive. Plus the more brownish colors. They have a mask around the eye, but it's not sharp edged and black like the Pacific tree frog. It's more just a dark smudge. And if the frog moves its back leg away from the side of its belly, you'll see those bold black and yellow, black and cream, red and yellow spots in there, in what's called the groin, which is where the back leg folds up against the side of the belly. So those are ways to distinguish from tree frogs, but the most important is the front toes and back toes. Tree frogs have those wide toe pads. Now they're often called suction cups. They're not really cups, but they do use a complicated suction system, and they can climb trees. And they can climb out of an aquarium or my plastic view box too. Red-legged frogs and other frogs around here have straight toe tips. We do have another kind of frog around here that is not native. And if you have a pond that is too wide open, not enough shade, not enough cover, not enough trees around the edges, weedy, sunny, hot, unfortunately, you may get American bullfrogs, which I will just call bullfrogs. They're a gorgeous, wonderful frog, but they don't belong here. They were brought here for food. Their back legs are meatier than our native ones. And they are big enough that they can eat the native frogs as well as fish, small children, ducklings, whatever. The bullfrog is often kind of greenish. It frequently has black polka dots all over it or just a dark mottling. It does not have the ridges along the side like the red-legged frog, but if you can see from the back of its eye around to sort of the corner of its mouth, there's a ridge that surrounds the eardrum, which is right on the surface. And the eardrum is huge in bullfrogs. The top photo is a female, the bottom photo was a male, and the eardrum actually, it looks like a bullseye. It's even bigger than its eye. They do usually have a bright green upper lip, and you can see that from quite a distance. A juvenile bullfrog, a young one that's just metamorphosed from a tadpole, is so big already, it's the same size as an adult red-legged frog. And just for fun, I put a photo of a little baby tree frog that just metamorphosed from a tadpole, and it's sitting on the very tip of my thumb. And so you can see a thumb in the two other photos, and imagine how little that tree frog is, and imagine that it would easily be a meal for a juvenile bullfrog. So there are a couple other frog species that may occur right around the edges of Clark County, mostly to the east and north edges where you get up into the mountains. Western toad could occur in a few places. You might find them in the county. They're easily recognizable by their bumpy skin, and they're not very graceful jumping because they have very wide bodies and very short back legs. The Cascades frog is only up in the mountains, higher elevations than its close cousin, the red-legged frog. It's rather similar to a red-legged frog, even more noticeable fold along the sides, the ridges along the sides of its back, which are called dorsolateral folds. And the Cascades frog usually has very sharp-edged black spots on its back. The Oregon spotted frog, you're probably not going to find. I spent several years on contract in Clark County looking for Oregon spotted frogs, and I kept thinking I was finding them, but they were not. They were all red-legged frogs. If you find a frog that looks kind of up at you with chartreuse eyes and spots on its back that look like a kid's drawing of a flower, take photos. Take photos anyway of anything you're not sure about. Send them to iNaturalist, send them to Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, send them to me at NERI, and we'll help you identify, because everybody wants to know if there are Oregon spotted frogs in places we don't know them at the moment. Okay, we'll move to the salamanders that lay their eggs in those same ponds along with tree frogs and red-legged frogs. And of course, there's our rough-skinned newt again. Some individuals may spend most of the year in the ponds, swimming around, eating everybody else's eggs, being just frequently obnoxious, but they're wonderful animals. The other two salamanders, you're less likely to see as adults. The long-toed salamander frequently has a yellow or greenish stripe down its back. They can be very beautiful. They are not always that fat. That one is a female that is absolutely bursting with eggs, heading for a pond to lay her eggs in the pond. But notice the back feet, and counting from the inside, the fourth toe on that back foot is super long. That's why it's called a long-toed salamander. The northwestern salamander is just plain brown. But if you look closely at the photo or the animal, you can see bunches of little tiny yellow dots, especially on the back of the head, the back corner. There's a big bulge with a lot of yellow dots. That's the parotoid gland. And each of those yellow dots is an opening to a poison gland. You can also see them along its sides on those folds of skin. They're along its back, along its tail. They do put out a poison. It looks white and milky and very, very scary, but it's actually not terribly toxic. The rough-skinned newt is the most toxic. If you ate one, you would die, guaranteed. But who's going to eat a newt? The newts do not put poison out on the surface of their skin. It's inside their skin. Northwestern salamander, the poison is put out on the surface of its skin. It wouldn't kill you, but it'd probably make you sick, and it would taste horrible. But we shouldn't be eating or hassling any of these animals. Rough-skinned newts, they're pretty calm. They're so slow, but they really just want to be left alone too. The lower photo, I know it looks like a plastic toy dinosaur or something, but that's actually a northwestern salamander that is not very happy that I took it out from under a sheet of bark, put it on top, and took photos of it. And so it's arched up, sort of pointing its poison glands. And if I continued to hassle it, it would have put out the poison, but I don't like hassling them, so I didn't. These adult pond salamanders, other than newts, live mostly underground, which is why it's rare to see a long-toed salamander or a northwestern salamander. They love going under a sheet of bark. They'll find a hole. It might be a snake hole. It might be a nightcrawler hole. And they're eating small worms, slugs, whatever. The bottom right photo there is a young northwestern salamander that we raised in captivity when we were writing the book and taking photos. And that little guy lived in its own hole that it made in the moss and rotting wood in a terrarium. And anytime we took the lid off, it knew it was going to get fed. So it would come stick its head and front legs out of the hole. And Chris would feed it little tiny slugs, which she fed it from her best sterling silver baby spoon. What you are likely to see from these amphibians right at this time of year, earlier than this, next few weeks, is the egg masses of these amphibians that breed in ponds. The egg masses of the big guys can be pretty conspicuous. The northwestern salamander, that's probably 2, maybe 3 egg masses, i.e. from 2 or 3 different females. Notice that they are wrapped around a twig, a branch, a stiff stem, and they're very smooth on the outside because the northwestern salamander female lays the eggs and then puts extra layers of jelly around them. The northern red-legged frog egg mass is a good size mass too. Those are covered with silt, but it shows how lumpy they are. It's just each egg has its jelly layer, but there are no extra layers around it. Otherwise, those could be a little bit confusing. And the northwestern salamander, the jelly is, it's like Jello. It's hard. You shouldn't pick it up, and certainly don't break it off the stem or pull it off the stem. All you got to do is poke it with your finger or even a stick, and it'll bounce away. It's so firm. Whereas the red-legged frog egg mass kind of slithers and slops around. It's very soft and does not hold its shape. And you can see the individual eggs there. And later on, when they're just about to hatch, the northwestern salamander, each little baby in there, embryo, almost a hatchling, already has its eyes totally developed. And you can see that you can see the extra layers of jelly around the individual eggs, but each egg gets a special green alga that grows inside it. And that's pretty interesting. They look beautiful when they have those green globes. Red-legged frog eggs, those are about to hatch. Little hatchling tadpoles don't have any sign of eyes yet. They're just a little lump with a tail, and they just hang around and feed on the yolk that's in their bellies until they grow big enough to move around and start feeding. Small egg masses in ponds are a little more confusing. Those two are long-toed salamander and tree frog. Long-toed salamander eggs look like mini versions of the northwestern salamander because those two are closely related. They're often laid around or along the edge of a twig or a blade of grass, whereas the tree frog egg mass is more of random shaped clump. It's stuck on something, and it might be around a blade of grass. But the photo on the right shows you that if you look closely, the eggs of long-toed salamander at the top of that photo on the right are a little bit larger individually. They're more widely separated in the egg mass, and there are frequently fewer of them. That's a big blob of algae or something that's stuck to that egg mass. And the eggs at the bottom are tree frog eggs, and they are smaller and packed more tightly, clustered more tightly into that small egg mass. And then, of course, got to talk about bullfrog eggs. But we don't need to, they wouldn't be confused with other egg masses because they're not laid until the middle of summer when the water is really warm. They're laid not in a round mass, but a layer at the surface or a kind of bunch of goopy, almost strands. They're kind of gross looking. Don't be looking for rough-skinned newt egg masses because they don't lay an egg mass. They lay their eggs individually. They frequently, you'll find a mating ball. Those are probably 4 or 5 males trying to get at one female. Once she's selected that one male and received his sperm with a spermatophore, she will lay her eggs one at a time and hide them separately down in the weeds. So it's almost impossible to find them. I think I've found 3 in my whole life. Okay, tadpoles. I'm not going to get into the little hatchling tadpoles, but the first thing to look at with any tadpole that you find is to look straight down from the top. That's where my little blue cup measure comes in handy. The tree frog, you'll notice that the eyes stick out to the sides and kind of interrupt the outline of the egg-shaped head body. They're on the side and they poke out to the side. Whereas red-legged frog and all the other frogs that we have right around here, the eyes are close together and they are inside that outline, egg-shaped outline of the head and body. Hope you can see that. That photo is a little dark. The tadpoles, well, a tadpole is a tadpole. Well, there's some differences, but they're subtle. Tree frog tadpole is frequently rather iridescent. They're kind of snub-nosed, fat-bellied, eyes poke out. Not a very beautiful outline, but beautiful iridescent coloring and a lovely wide fin, that dorsal fin that arches up from the middle of the back out to the end of the tail. Red-legged frog tadpole also has that same arching tail fin that starts kind of up on the back. They're apt to be covered, they're apt to be dark colored, but covered with kind of brassy, bronzy speckles. And then, of course, the bullfrog tadpole gets to be gigantic. And the reason it does, I'll get to in a second. Notice back up to the tree frog at the top, that little guy is already starting to grow its back legs. So it has started the process of metamorphosis. The red-legged frog, you really can't see any sign of a back leg there. And the bullfrog, there's a little tiny back leg kind of at the back end of that, its yellow belly. So it's just beginning to metamorphose. Bullfrog tadpoles start out tiny. Those are millimeters. It's like a 1/4 inch long, the little hatchling. But it takes 2 or 3 years before a bullfrog tadpole can metamorphose. Some of them will do it in 1 year, but that's uncommon. So the yearling bullfrog tadpole, it has black polka dots, but otherwise can look fairly similar to a red-legged frog tadpole. But once the bullfrog tadpole gets as big as the bottom photo, there's no way you're going to mistake it for anything else. Okay, here's one of the toughest things in amphibian identification is salamander larvae. Long-toed salamander and northwestern salamander are closely related, and so it's logical for them to look similar. Rough-skinned newt is not closely related, but they look similar anyway, which can be quite frustrating. Long-toed salamanders tend to have spiky gills. Northwestern salamanders tend to have feathery, softer gills. Rough-skinned newts tend to have kind of floppy, droopy gills. But notice also that on a fairly large newt larva, there are several rows of little yellow dots along its sides. If you find those, you know you got a newt larva, but you don't see them all the time. When they first hatch out, the pond salamanders are easier to identify than when they get bigger. Long-toed and northwestern salamanders start out with no sign of front legs, back legs, and they would just fall over in the mud and get buried when an elk wandered through. But they have those tiny little fleshy, look like one whisker on each side of the front of the head. Can you see that? In front of the gills. Those are called balancers, and it's just a little bit of skin that can help them stay upright. The newt does not have that because they're in a different family. The long-toed salamander, you can see those spiky tips to the gills. Northwestern salamander, you can see the beginnings of kind of feathery gills. And the rough-skinned newt, that one already has its front legs developed, but they develop very quickly, partly because they don't have those balancers. So they need something to keep from falling over very quickly. Back legs will develop a little bit later. Notice that the long-toed salamander has a very round head, the northwestern salamander a big blocky head, and the newt has a big head, but it gets narrow at the snout in front of the eyes. Sometimes they can look almost pointed, and that can be helpful. And then you get the bigger ones, and it's even tougher. So there's the newt upper left with a slightly narrower end of its nose or snout. You can't really see yellow dots on that one. I guess you can a little bit. Northwestern salamander with a big blocky head. and the long-toed salamander with a smaller but still pretty blocky head. Fortunately, their timing is often a little different. Long-toed salamander is in and out of the pond in a big hurry. They're all metamorpho. They lay eggs really early. They metamorphose and leave the pond by midsummer. Newts can leave the pond in midsummer to fall, or they might winter over. Northwestern salamander larvae almost always winter over, so they're growing more slowly, and so you might not have them all the same size at the same time in a particular pond. The juveniles will all leave the pond. The photo on the left there is looking under a big rock that was on wet mud right near the edge of a pond. And there are a bunch of little baby toads and long-toed salamanders. And back in the shadows where you can't see them, there are also newts and northwestern salamanders, and the tree frogs all jumped out before I got the picture taken. They all like to hide in the mud. They have to come out of the water because they're breathing air now, and they're going to hide where it's wet. And at night, they'll move up into the woods or whatever and find ways to get underground. The photo on the right shows the long-toed salamander with a nice yellow stripe. Up at the very top is a little tiny newt. They come out of the pond even smaller than a long-toed salamander. And in the middle, where you can't really see it, is a northwestern salamander. And it's quite a bit bigger because it's a full year older than the other two before it is apt to come out of the pond. The northwestern salamander is the only one of those salamanders that also has a completely alternate lifestyle. It can stay in the pond forever, for its whole life. It retains the gills and the tail fin. It's a larva, but it will become sexually mature, and only some individuals do that. And of course, they have to have a pond that has water in it year round. So you can see the gills, you can see the little yellow dots between the gills and the eye where that parotoid gland is. These are called neotenic or pedomorphic larvae. You can also call it a neotene or a pedomorph. Too many names. Anyway, they get pretty big, 8 inches total length, but the metamorphosed adult northwestern salamanders can get even bigger. 9 inches is about as long as they get, and they're pretty impressive when they get that big. But wait till we get to giant salamanders, but not quite yet. I will now move from ponds to streams, and I'm not talking about streams and rivers that have mud at the bottom, or like the Columbia River. Those are probably not going to provide any habitat for amphibians except somebody passing through. But streams that have rocks at the bottom, big rocks, small rocks, cobbles, pebbles, there are some really neat amphibians that live in those. And you might have some in the foothills and especially at the north and east parts of Clark County. In really, really perfect little streams with absolutely clear water, no silt, cold, shaded, nice, rocky, fresh, fast-moving, well-aerated water. You might have Cascade Torrent salamander, that little guy at the top. They look quite yellow with some black speckles. They're in the edges of streams, down in gravel, wet gravel. They're in springs and seeps. And then the coastal tailed frog is amazing. The frog lives in the cold streams. They'll be out in the wet weather, but not very far from streams, out in the forest. But the tadpoles of tailed frog are really cool. They're flattened at the bottom, frequently have that white tip to the tail, because look at that bottom right photo. That's the underside. That's one clinging to the side, the inside of one of my plastic viewing boxes. they have that gigantic mouth that actually is a suction disc. And so they can cling to the rocks. Otherwise, I mean, any other tadpole would wash away in the fast stream. They can also, if you see the lines at the back end edge of the mouth, those are little rough spots made of keratin, same as your fingernails, and they can scooch forward on a rock and scrape with those scrapers and eat algae and diatoms on the rock. That's how they survive. And then we get to the giant salamanders. We got two flavors of them here. Cope's giant salamander at the bottom there is much rarer. They really like the headwater streams, springs, seeps. They're often with tailed frogs and cascade torrent salamanders. They're quite delicate in build, so not really that much of a giant. They never get more than, I don't know, maybe 6-7 inches long, if that. Rather delicate build, long body between the legs. Head is kind of rectangular almost, and gills are small because they're living in streams that have a lot of oxygen in the water, so they don't need a lot of surface area to the gills. The upper photo is the big guy, coastal giant salamander. Used to be called Pacific giant salamander, but you can still use either term. They have an enormous head, nice bushy gills, because they can live in not absolutely pristine streams and rivers. So they need a little more surface area to get more oxygen. They're not going to be in muddy streams, but you'll find them in quite a few of the streams and rivers in Clark County, I would think, certainly in the Pacific Northwest, in the Gorge and all. They have a shorter, stockier body and that enormous head, but it can be pretty tricky to tell them apart from copes. So take photos. Have a plastic view box too. Side view, again, the Cope's giant salamander is just more elongate and delicate and slender. The notch in its tail there at the bottom is just exactly the right shape to probably prove that it was in a fight with another giant salamander that took a big bite out of its tail. And the coastal giant salamander is just a heftier, meatier, bulkier animal with a bigger tail fin that often has black marks on it. Coastal giant salamanders, when they metamorphose, they don't all, they still live in or near the stream, but you can occasionally find them out in the woods. When it's really wet out, they will be in and under bark piles, down logs, things like that. They have a wonderful marbled pattern on their head and back and sides, sometimes rather pale as the top photo. That middle photo is just, that's to me the most beautiful color. It's a brassy, bronzy, it looks metallic, and just a wonderful pattern like it's lace overlaid on a dark surface. And the bottom one has a more mild, mottled or almost paisley print. They get to be big. Those, that one, that's my hand just holding its head. That guy was probably, 9 inches long or something. But the neotenic coastal giant salamanders, the ones that remain as larvae in the streams, get to be 14 inches long. Now, that photo at the top, it's in my view box. That one's only 10 inches long. I've seen a bigger one than that, but I couldn't catch it, much less take a photo of it. They are just amazing. Look at those bushy gills. But 14 inches is nothing. If you go to China, they've got giant salamanders that can be 4 feet long, putting our little guys to shame, but I love them anyway. Okay, amphibians, when they come out of ponds, when they come out of streams and rivers, Or if they live on land all the time, they need these things. They need shade because they dry out and they don't like getting overheated. They need moisture, they need a source of food, and they need hiding cover. So most of us don't have a beautiful old growth forest with gigantic logs in our backyard. You might have it nearby, and that's great. Uh, Bottom left photo shows a forested talus area with rocks, lots of nice moss, down wood, shady trees. Okay, most of us don't have that in our backyard, but you can take slabs of wood or particularly bark, big pieces of bark off of firewood or just pieces you have lying around, and put those in shady areas in your backyard, and you'll get critters under them. There are some salamanders that don't ever need to go to a pond or a stream. They lay their eggs on land. Encetina is the most common of those. They can be found frequently in wood piles or debris piles. That's a big debris pile of bark and rotting wood under a great big snag that's falling apart. And these salamanders, they're frequently called woodland salamanders or terrestrial, fully terrestrial salamanders. They, instead of laying eggs in water, they develop a very few eggs inside the female's belly, and they might only have 6 or 8 or 9 eggs, but they go through the whole larval stage in the egg, inside the egg. So she'll find a good spot way down underground, down in rotting wood in the middle of a huge rotting log that stays real wet, lay her eggs, and she stays with them until they hatch out. And by the time they hatch out, no gills, no tail fins, they look like mini versions of the adult, except they might have a different color pattern. Those are baby encetinas on the right, bottom right, and they have the orange at the base of the legs. The babies often have those wonderful bright sparkly speckles on them called iridophores, and they are very, very cute. So the most common of the terrestrial salamanders that you could easily have in your backyard are that encetina, and there's one at the top. The other thing to notice about encetina is the big bulging eyes. It has rather a stout body and head and legs. And also look at the base of its tail, just a little behind its back legs. You can see kind of rings around it. Those are places where the salamander can drop its tail off. If a predator grabs it, it's most apt to be fleeing, and what the predator gets is the tail, and the salamander can just drop its tail then, and those particular sites won't bleed. And the salamander can run away and grow a new tail, and the predator hasn't caught the most important part of the animal. Western redback salamander is the other very common salamander in Clark County. They look like a ribbon, very delicate, long, elongated build. They also will drop their tails at any section of it if a predator grabs them or if you grab them by the tail. So I always tell people, if you're going to pick up a salamander, and they would prefer you don't, sort of scoop it up. Don't grab it by the tail, or you will end up with a wiggling tail in your hand and you will be very upset. Western redback salamanders are usually black. They often have a red dorsal stripe, but not all. Oh, let me go back for a sec. I just wanted to point out how well behaved. This is a well-trained Western redback salamander. When I wanted to measure its length, it just lined up perfectly, but they usually don't do that. Western redback salamanders can have a broad red stripe, a red stripe with black mottling in the middle. Many of them have a bright yellow stripe, or a dull yellow stripe, or almost no stripe at all, like the one in the bottom photo. Those are all Western redback salamanders. Check out the toes. Have you heard me say that before? The toes are different, and I put a long-toed salamander in this picture because they can be confused with a Western redback salamander, but the proportions are different. Long-toed salamander is chunky. It has a flattened tail, flattened side to side because it swims in ponds, and there's that incredible fourth toe on the back foot is so long. The middle photo is an Ensatina that probably dropped its tail and is growing a new one. That's a pretty short tail, but you can see that pinched off place where it broke off the old tail. And it has pretty broad feet, but it's a pretty husky shaped salamander. And the Western redback, that's a young one, so it's not as elongated as it will be later on. But it has rather delicate toes. And notice the outer toe on the back foot there, the lowest toe. It's pretty short, but nothing compared to the slight possibility that you might have of finding a Larch Mountain salamander. They're in the gorge, they're east of Clark County, but they could be in the very east edge of Clark County. Their back foot has a fifth toe that is so small it doesn't even have a second joint on it. They are beautiful, bright salamanders, but at a glance look like Western redback, but they have orange on the belly. I was wearing the right color gloves that particular day. And they have less black on the sides and more patches of white speckles on the sides. Anyway, I won't do much more with those. So now it's time for you to go out and find some salamanders and frogs, and I hope you will do that. iNaturalist is a great place to send your findings. And if you have questions, you can call others. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife wants to know what you find, maybe not every newt that you find. So if you can find the frogs and salamanders in those photos, you're doing well, because they are camouflaged often. And the bottom right photo there, I've lifted up a big sheet of bark and there was a baby Ensatina under it. So have a good time finding amphibians. Remember, check out the toes and check out the eyes on the tadpoles and have a good time with those. So if you have questions, I'm hoping I didn't run too long and that we've got time for lots of questions now. If we don't have time for your question now, you can send it to me through the Northwest Ecological Research Institute's website, and it'll eventually get to me.
Thank you, Char. Yay! We have a number of questions, so I'll just get started. First, I want to start off kind of with a fun question. What is your favorite amphibian species to find?
Oh man, that's the toughest question of all. It's usually whatever I've just found and am holding in my hand, and that could be a newt or a tree frog, but if I really had to say, it would be an Oregon slender salamander, which don't occur in Clark County.
No, they don't. But I found some of those with you once.
Yes, you did. Yeah.
My favorite is the Western toad. I just love them so much.
Yeah, toads for sure. That's my grandkids call me Bubo, which is the 4-letter code for Bufo boreas, the Western toad. That's nice.
My Are there any specific tricks or methods you use to remember the scientific names?
Oh, interesting. I didn't even mention any of the scientific names today. Um, no, you just have to learn them. And I've just had to learn them all over again because several of them, quite a few of them, were just changed. New genetic studies have improved our understanding really of the relationships between frogs. For instance, bullfrog used to be Rana catesbiana, which put it in the same family as Rana aurora, the northern red-legged frog. But the studies have found that they're really not closely related, and bullfrog is now, what does the L stand for?
Physiobiosis.
Lithobates,
Yeah,
Lithobates
little the
catesbiana.
babies.
It kept its catesbiana, but it's Lithobates now instead of Rana. So yeah, no, with that's like learning bird songs. You just have to memorize them. I don't have any tricks. Sorry.
Um, so I had a number of questions that kind of evolved around like what amphibians were doing this time of year. And also like if they were going to freeze, or if they do freeze, and how they might be protected from the winter storms we're going to have, and how they deal with that. So, and specifically around like tree frogs in ponds. Like I said, a couple different people asked that sort of question.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. Um, the amphibians are so tuned into the moisture and the temperature, they can tell generally when it's starting to get cold and dry, and they will either go down to the bottom of the pond. Some hibernate there in the winter, and they can go back down to the pond and slow down their breathing, slow down their heart rate, and sort of semi-hibernate for a short time. They're more apt to simply go down under, go into wooded areas, or even fields that have a lot of dense, tall grass and brush, and just hunker down where it doesn't freeze solid. But that's a really good reason to have cover around in your yard: logs, bark piles, old boards, anything that they can get under that stays damper and keeps them from freezing. Now, I did just once years ago have a situation where I had been monitoring a really small, shallow pond that was just loaded with long-toed salamanders. They laid eggs all over that thing. And we had a sudden cold snap just when it was in January, but it had been really warm. They'd been laying eggs. And I went out there right afterwards, and I did find some dead adult long-toed salamanders, and the eggs had frozen. But as with most populations, the population sort of hedges its bets. Not everybody lays eggs at the same time. And so some of the females were able to come in later and lay eggs, and they were fine. And many adults had hunkered down. Either they'd gone down, nightcrawler burrows, or they were down at the bottom of the pond, and they did survive. So they can usually, salamanders and frogs generally can figure out, a place to be safe. But yeah, a really sudden, really cold snap, we could have a few deaths with these next few days, because things are in the middle of breeding. But it's getting cold and dry over a couple of days, and that gives the animals time to find a good spot to be safe for a while.
Cool. There was a comment that somebody made that I wanted to share with you. They said that egg photos are just like really, somebody else even commented, all of the photos are amazing and beautifully done. And then did you take all of the photos that are in this presentation?
Oh, okay. Yes, I did. Over many, many, many years.
Excellent. So good job, Shar.
Thank you.
Somebody else asked, where can you find those window boxes that you showed at the beginning?
Ha. You can't find them. You have to have them built. Tap Plastics. I've had them build numerous boxes for me. Uh, they've gotten more expensive over the years. You have to specify to them that you want to be able to take photos through them. So they will make the edges, they'll be very clean with the glue that they use. They'll make the little ones with a little stand so it doesn't tip over. You do have to make sure it's open at the top so you can put things in and out. But I recommend Tap Plastics.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock, so I'm gonna ask one more question. I know that there is a lot of questions that were not answered, and I'm sorry about that. Again, if you have any more questions, feel free to contact Shar at info@neary.org. Or you can also contact me and I can forward some questions along to her or answer them myself. So I think the last question, oh, there's so many good questions. I am going to, there was a number about like working with amphibians, and I think so much in your photos you showed like the gloves and stuff. So people wanted to know about like if the oils on your hands or
Yes.
if there was any best practices around handling amphibians, both the adults and egg masses, and anything of like also like properly locating them afterwards.
Yes, good. And I just, that's a whole other subject. But yes, we do need to be careful not only about transmitting amphibian diseases from one animal to another, but also your hands, believe it or not, have salt, have oils. Amphibians breathe through their skin a lot of the time. You know, the terrestrial salamanders, that's how they breathe. They don't have real lungs. And so they breathe through their skin. You don't want to get anything on their skins. You certainly don't want to get like, bug dope, sunscreen. Do not have that on your hands if you're going to touch any amphibians. The best is to take photos or wear gloves, keep the gloves wet, keep rubbing them off in mud, and then disinfect everything: boots, nets, gloves, everything between sites. That can be with alcohol. If you're going to several sites during the day, you bring your gear home, and before you go out the next day to a different pond or stream or whatever, disinfect everything with 15% bleach. No, 10% bleach for 15 minutes. I forget what it is. I'll put it on the website. It's on our website, I think. We do have to be very careful. If it's at all possible to not touch things, that is the best. But gee, I can't resist. I mean, here I am catching. But notice that tree frog, I held him in leaves. That's another possibility.
Well, thank you so much today, Shar, for joining us. And again, I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of your questions, but feel free to give us an email or a call if you have additional questions. Shar is more than welcome to answer them. And thank you again for joining us all, and have a wonderful afternoon.